Hi everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Cotrera, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. We're continuing pandemic pedagogy today. I don't know when you're watching this, but I think this is going to be one of the last videos that I filmed for the summer. I want to do a pause. I mean, I won't be pausing, just so we're clear. I do a lot of stuff. I won't be pausing. I'm going to do a little pause for the series in order to prep for the series for the fall, and I'm also turning all the transcripts from all of the conversations into an OER, an open educational resource, so an ebook, so that if you weren't able to watch them all or listen to them all on the podcast, you can also read them, because I think that these are such important conversations, and I want you to be able to access them in whatever way is the most comfortable for you. So I know that you've been enjoying them, so thank you so much for your emails and your direct messages and your comments, because I think that this is a really important conversation, and I'm so glad that there's so many people and so many different ways of approaching history education that have been involved with this conversation. And today is no exception. I am so excited of who I get to talk to today, especially because I asked him to speak for the series in early April, early on in our lockdown life. He wasn't able to participate in the series because he was working on the manuscript that is now done. So I'm really excited to hear about the manuscript as well as the other work that he's doing. So anyway, I'm talking today to Adam Bunch. Adam is the founder of the Tron of Dreams project, which is a public history project that won an honorable mention for the Governor General's Awards in Public History. So it's just a really cool project. He's just a really cool guy with these different ideas of engaging with public history. He's also the host of the Canadian history documentary series, Canadiana. He is the author of the Toronto Book of the Dead, and his new book that will be out in 2021, which he just finished, is called the Toronto Book of Love. And like I said, they'll be out in 2021. So all of these different things together is just going to be such a rewarding element to the conversation. And he's been thinking about these things more in a teaching and learning context, like a formal teaching and learning context, because he also teaches public history at George Brown College. So anyway, I'm just really excited to meet him because I haven't met him before, and I think he's going to bring a lot to the conversation. So let's go over to Zoom. Adam, thank you so much for getting in touch with me. I know that this COVID period, you already would have been in quarantine because you were working on the last part of your manuscript. And so I'm really excited that we are talking as we're moving into the summer. Before we begin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Adam Bunch. I've been working sort of on a variety of different public history related projects over the last decade or so. So I started with creation of a project called the Tron of Dreams project, which sort of does interventions in public space with little fictional dreams I write about figures from Toronto's history that I then print on little cards and leave in public places that are somehow related to that person's true history. Each one has a URL, so people who find the cards can then look up the card and find more true information about that historical figure. And that's led to a lot of other things. So I've written a lot for Spacing Magazine. I wrote a book called the Toronto Book of the Dead and have a new one coming out called the Toronto Book of Love. And also host a little but ambitious Canadian history YouTube series called Canadiana, where we travel across the country, sort of looking for interesting stories, and generally just try to engage with as many people as we can to teach them more about their history and get them interested and excited and more knowledgeable about the place they live. And this year too, I've been teaching a little bit at George Brown about the history of Toronto, just in time for the pandemic to hit and everything to change drastically, just as I was finally starting to get a handle on it.
Well, I think even veteran educators also was like, oh, I'm 20 years into it. I was just getting a handle on it, and then COVID happened. So I wouldn't feel too bad about that. I want to say a couple things after that introduction. One, there is drilling outside your apartment, so anyone watching, the extra sound is just like an extra sound of the city, so that's fine. The second thing, I want to link to Julian Chambliss's video that I did in early June about Afrofuturisms and how like thinking about other ways to engage in the past can really help us think through these narratives for the future. And that's why I've always really liked the Tron of Dreams project, because I think that bringing in imagination and bringing in creative nonfiction can really help us think through the histories we want, the futures we want, and those meld together. Although we didn't really plan on talking about this, can you talk about how that started?
Yeah, so my background was in screenwriting coming out of school. So I've always been writing fiction since I was a kid. And I was working downtown in Toronto in what is the oldest neighborhood of the city, down by the St. Lawrence Market and St. James Cathedral, and sort of just being more immersed in the history every day. So being surrounded by plaques and older buildings than a lot of Toronto has. And it was actually, 10 summers ago now, when Banksy visited Toronto and was doing stenciled art around the city, which I went. There was one on an old historic building on the Esplanade that I went to go see at lunch one day from my dreary 9-to-5 job. And it was neat. Banksy's cool, he does neat stuff, but it struck me that it looked so much like the same stuff he'd done in Melbourne, like the month before, that there was no reason it needed to be in Toronto at all or on this particular historic building. And at the same time, I'd been writing these absurdist little short stories that were sort of dreamlike. It struck me that making them about historical figures would be a way to give them more meaning. And I always liked the idea of engaging with public places, but I am far too much of a coward to go paint on the side of a building. So making those dreams about historical figures in Toronto, making them something with sort of place-based meaning, and being able to leave them somewhere so that somebody could engage with them in that place and sort of maybe interrupt their day a little bit and remind them that there's this history happening, and in a way that's hopefully interesting and engaging and a little different, and sort of break that myth everyone always talks about history being boring and being lists of dates and events, that by doing these sort of dreamlike short stories to sort of highlight the fact that historical figures were human beings with passions and dreams, quite literally, and nightmares just like us, is hopefully, a way to hook people and interrupt their days and get them thinking more about the history of a place and a city and a country where so frequently people sort of forget that it has a history just like everywhere else. So hopefully by finding the dreams, get interested in that historical figure and be more interested in learning the true stories sort of behind the dream and learn more about the place where they live. And I've also sort of taken it around the world, gone across Europe and the UK and other cities in Canada, sort of helping to hopefully sort of bridge the geographical divide too. It's easy to just focus on what happened in Toronto when you're talking about Toronto history, or in Canada when you're talking about Canadian history. And I think a lot of stories that happened somewhere else, but that had deep meaning to this place, especially this city and this country, which is so much a collection of people from around the world, that hopefully kind of uses new digital media to be able to bring that history to people where they are, and that history to people in Toronto, realize that we're connected to the history around the world.
Yeah, one of the things I like to talk about is how important it is in Canada that we think of our histories as transnational histories. Like, the more we just think of it as like the stories of this place, we are losing all of the connections across many nations, like nations within this land in Canada, but also the many different places that so many people came from. And it's always been really cool because I know that you've done some traveling to be able to see those linkages. And of course, I'll put your website down below and links to all the stuff that you do so people can explore that. And it's interesting because a few of the videos that I did like in the last week, we've talked about geographies related to history. So it's a kind of a nice, I'm glad you're here now. It's like a nice kind of intersection between some of the conversations we're having. So let's get started with the first question, which is, have you thought about history any different because of this moment? And, people's responses to this have kind of shifted, but I think of those early days in lockdown and I had to leave my house and I'm walking in my neighborhood and I'm looking around at these buildings and thinking, our histories never kind of pick up on these multi-layered emotions and anxieties that everyone is feeling. And so how do we capture that in our teaching and learning? So it made me rethink or kind of solidify things I was already thinking about history. Have you thought of history any different because of this moment? Have there been any moments like that during this time that have caused you to think a little differently?
Yeah, I think you're right that it adds a lot of depth and opens up reminders. Like intellectually, of course, I've always known, and anybody who spends a lot of time thinking about history knows that it's an ongoing process and something that's always happening and that we're living through it no matter what's happening. Even the most privileged people in the world are part of historical processes and events. Usually it's not so viscerally obvious as it is right now. So that's something that's certainly been striking me, that you cannot ignore the fact that we're all part of a major historical event or two, with the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests. And we'll see what happens over the next year or two. That sort of reminds you a lot of things. It makes you viscerally and emotionally realize things you might know intellectually. And I think provides sort of a nearly universal touchstone in a way we haven't had much of during our lifetimes. That this is something that definitely the pandemic changes people in different ways depending on their circumstances and their privileges, but it's certainly an event that we'll all remember for the rest of our lives, and can also provide a connection because of that to people who are maybe realizing that history is more relevant than they'd been given to think up until this point. That so much of what I spend my time thinking about is how to reach people who aren't history students, who aren't history nerds like us, who have grown up maybe not without the best history teachers, who do think of it as something irrelevant to their daily lives, that's in dusty old books, lists of events and names, and maybe are new Canadians, or even a lot of my students at George Brown are international students who don't feel the same kind of ownership of Toronto history as people who have been here longer might. But this is an event that makes it clear that history is relevant and is an ongoing process. So, telling people a story about the Spanish flu right now gets them a lot more engaged than it did a year ago, because people can see that what we're going through is something similar to past events, and that there are relevant lessons to be learned that don't always translate exactly, but are clearly something that we can be learning from, and something to that the Black Lives Matter protests drives home as well. At the end of my course at George Brown, I sort of tried to, in fact, the whole way through the course, show that history was an ongoing process and that definitions are always changing, that Toronto went from being a place that was very specifically founded to be just British and white and Protestant, but that over the last 200 years, people have broadened that definition of what it means to be Torontonian, what it means to be Canadian, and that's been a struggle, that people in power haven't just handed over more rights and more of an inclusive identity without having a struggle and people in the streets and rebellions and protests. And that's something too that this particular moment in history makes viscerally more obvious when people can see what's happening in the streets and with police forces and people in power and debates that are happening at city council. That it's something that has been struggled for and in a way that you can still see happening. That it becomes more obvious than ever within our lifetimes anyway, and at least within my own privileged position, that it is an ongoing process and that history's a communal undertaking that we're all building all the time. And I think this moment sort of gives us an opportunity to connect with people who might not always have realized that themselves, that history is something that's deeply important and happening all the time.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's a couple things there that I really just want to highlight. And one is when you said kind of early on about we may have intellectually known something, but this moment of crisis or these crises have allowed us to kind of think through these more viscerally. And I think that's just a really nice thing to pull up about the different ways we come to know things and then the different ways we come to know history. I remember talking to one of the teachers and I was like, sometimes you're just sitting in a classroom as a student and you're like, this doesn't feel right. You might not have the words for it because you don't know the history, but you know the feeling. And so when you know it intellectually, but how coming to know the feeling, I think that's kind of an interesting kind of articulation and articulating it in relation to the work that you do about these dreams and this creative nonfiction related to history kind of taps into why engaging with stories of the past are important on these different levels, because it does help you get to know on different levels.
Yeah, I think once you realize sort of viscerally and emotionally that you're a historical figure and that in 100 years people are going to be talking about this moment the way that we talk about things that happened 100 years ago or the Spanish flu and things like that. And that it helps highlight the fact that people in the past might not have lived in the same world as us or been identical to the way we think, but that they were rounded, real human beings who had feelings and passions and emotions, which is something I've been thinking a lot about for the last few months as I finish up the Toronto Book of Love, which talks about romance and marriage and scandal through Toronto's history as a way, hopefully, of highlighting that exact thing, that people are and always have been these passionate, loving, hating, emotional beings, and that one way to get people more interested and more engaged with history is by highlighting that fact and reminding them that people from the past weren't entirely different than us. It wasn't just a bunch of stodgy old white dudes who just passed legislation or went off to war and fought well laid out diagrammed battles. It's all messy and in a similar way to this moment, they didn't know what was going to happen next, just like we don't. They had feelings and emotions about everything that was happening, were passionately invested in those historical events. And then if you can sort of tease up some of that emotion, whether it's by telling love stories or talking about what kind of dreams they might have had, then hopefully you're able to, hook people who might not otherwise get hooked.
Yeah, Julian Chambliss, as I mentioned before, who was talking about Afrofuturisms, he was like, when we bring in narratives, he's like, I like comic books, but maybe you like romance. You can do that with that type of narrative too. And so I think that's an interesting way. I'm excited for your next book because I think it is nice to be able to bring in those very affective, those very emotional narratives. The other thing I wanted to say about that your first answer is when you're when you said, it's always been a struggle to define Toronto and define who and what Toronto is. And we are that struggle never ended, right? It's an ongoing struggle. And I think that was just kind of a nice way to articulate something that a lot of people have talked about in this series, that it will help young people in particular understand themselves as historical actors, but also within a historical continuum. And I really like the way you articulated that. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Great.
Great. So this makes me think then about my second question about, do you think we will teach history differently after this moment? Do you think maybe becoming more aware of different layers of history or different histories that we might find kind of relevant, or educators who had already helped people think about their sense of being in a historical moment and being a historical actor, do you think those will translate into the ways we teach and learn history? And I mean that in both formal classrooms, but also informal settings like the public history work that you do, the Dreams Project, the documentary series, any sort of way to mobilize the past. Do you think we're going to do that any different after this moment?
It has highlighted, hopefully, the idea of history as a process and something that continues all along. And I've been thinking a lot more about that and what that will mean to people who are alive right now, that it's sort of more obvious to more people that that's what happens. And have seen some great examples. I can't remember who it was, but someone on Twitter was talking about having their students sort of talk about what historical artifacts would sum up this time for people in the future, beyond masks or placards, sort of what things in the world right now would tell that story for the future, and thinking through things like that, like how is this moment being made into history, whose stories are going to get told about this moment into the future. All those kind of processes are laid bare right now, that you can sort of see the inner workings of history and how it gets made in a way that isn't as obvious to everyone all the time. That hopefully opens up some new possibilities for sort of teaching people about historiography and getting them engaged, even if they're not hardcore history people or history students. And I think too, it creates that visceral connection that is an opportunity to reach people who might not have been reached before in ways they might not have been reached. It makes it kind of obvious which examples, like the story of the Spanish flu, is so much more relevant to people now. And you can use that as a way into telling other stories and use it as an example of certain processes and that kind of thing. And on a practical level, we're all being forced to reach our students or audiences in different ways since we can't physically be with them. So certainly, I think there are a lot of drawbacks to that and a lot of negatives to being forced online against our wills, but that it hopefully gives us a chance to learn some things that once we've returned to being able to reach people directly, we'll have more tools in our toolbox than we might have had otherwise. So that hopefully online is something that can engage some people rather than just the focus on in-person, that will be able to sort of give people more ways of choosing how they're going to engage with material. And that's certainly something that with the Dreams Project and with Canadiana, the documentary series, that I've been doing for a while, trying to use, leverage new media to talk about old stories that, even now I'm going to have to rethink now that the book's in. I'm finally going to get to go back to telling current stories and working on Twitter and Facebook and trying to reach people that way in new ways. So I think this moment is just going to kind of force us to teach in different ways and develop some new skills and methods. And hopefully that is, we have to probably be careful that that becomes a positive thing and something that adds to the ways of teaching instead of, moving everything online and seeing it as a cheaper, faster, more exploitative way of doing things. But that there are real opportunities there to reach people in new ways now that we're sort of being forced to learn them.
John Heckman, the tattooed historian, I did a talk with him, and he was like, it's hard to kind of explain like who he is. He's like a brand, like a history brand, but he wouldn't call himself a public historian, although I would. And he said that like this could be a real creative boom during this time for public history in particular, and like he really hopes it's not a bubble that will burst after this. And when I talked to Kat Ackerfeld from the Toronto's First Post Office, and when I talked to Joe McGill from the Slave Dwelling Project, they both were like, if we, like, this is a moment that can change the narratives of a lot of like public history spaces. And Joe McGill from the Slave Dwelling Project, he was saying too that like, so he goes to different slave dwellings and he sleeps there and he does interpretation about the lives of those who were enslaved in those spaces. And he said that, you know, some African Americans, some Black audience members would not go to those events because they didn't want to be in those spaces, but the online interpretation can allow them to learn from and do some healing with the interpretation of those spaces without having to go. And like, it's kind of interesting, the possibilities, like the things coming up in the cracks of these things. Like, sure, we're rushing and we're doing it and it doesn't seem comfortable and it seems like, sure, let's just do it faster, cheaper. But like, there's some really kind of interesting possibilities that are coming from this moment, these creative possibilities, which is pretty exciting.
And it's something, a lot of my work is centered around physical locations and geography and psychology and going to the place and sort of trying to function as sort of an avatar, a portal for people online who can't necessarily get to that place. Now, when people are stuck at home so much, but it's like I go leave a dream, one of my cards, in a physical location, mostly around Toronto, but as I said, I've gone across the UK and Europe last summer, going to those physical locations and then using that, the moment I drop the dream as a way of reaching an audience that isn't in that physical location with the story of that location. So when I leave a dream somewhere, the person who finds it in that place hopefully engages with the story and goes and follows the URL. But in some ways, even more important than that is the fact that I'm posting it on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and therefore able to reach thousands of people. One person might find the dream, but thousands of people who follow on social media get connected to that place, whether it's, you know, a dream I leave at Fort York in Toronto, which is an obvious historical site, or you know, an obscure, like a graveyard in Rome where Toronto historical figures' parents are buried, and you can tell the story of how their time in Rome ended up influencing their work in Toronto, and how Lauren Harris's house, built by a woman who is a modernist architect who basically only ever got to build one building, and it's Lauren Harris's house, because she was a woman and a modernist before her time, learned, you know, did her architectural study in Rome, and being able to tie people to that location and that place in a way they might not get to do themselves, and sort of unite the digital world and physical locations, which is something that's exciting about this moment, which is so unexciting in so many ways, is that it does sort of open that up and make that more important and more something everybody's sort of dealing with and figuring out ways to do. Like something where you might have only done it in person for a small audience because it's location based. You may be forced to stream online or reach a wider audience that might, you know, dig up some lessons and some ways of reaching broader audiences and finding new ways of telling stories that'll hopefully be useful tools going into the future.
You know, I said this earlier, that a theme that's been coming up in these later talks is a focus on like geographies and space. And I'm here, I'm talking about history, not so much geography, but like, it's really, if I was just gonna like do another series for the next month, I would want to like think about place related to this moment. Like, how can we, like, connection to spaces and places are important, and I think your work really demonstrates that. So when we can't do that, when we are located in this space and place, how can we still revere another space and place? And like that, those are historical questions. And so, like, thank you for contributing to that kind of meta conversation that some of the series have had.
Yeah, it is a particularly challenging moment for that. To be able to connect with our histories so frequently involves being in the place where something happened or seeing the artifact with our own eyes. But I think you can sort of create that kind of connection online if you do it well. And it's something I think we're all sort of being forced to learn right now.
Well, and that sometimes sometimes there is a real argument for still engaging in spaces and places during this time. Like, I mean, again, I'm going to mention Julian Chambliss's talk because I feel like there's some really nice connections. We were talking about Juneteenth, which is a holiday in the States, and about how like people going out right now to protest for Black Lives Matter really echoes a lot of the celebrations for Juneteenth throughout the last 150 or so years, because it is a way of marking your presence in public places and spaces. And so it's kind of interesting the way space and geography are working in this moment related to history. In ways that, like I said, didn't really come up at the beginning part of the series. I also just want to highlight that you're the first person to say the word historiography on this series. That, like, when we think about teaching history, you're right. This is a moment to teach historiography, and I think that's a really kind of interesting point. So, thanks for being the first.
Yeah, it does sort of lay bare the workings of historiography and makes it sort of clearer to everyone. They might not be seeing it themselves, but it's an opportunity for people who are already thinking of it all the time to point it out and how these things are made. And you're right too, like this moment highlights maybe even more how much place is important, and that we can use the digital world to highlight those places and point out how important it is for us to be out and about and taking to the streets and physically being somewhere, demanding change and engaging with those places, which is something it's really easy to forget in Toronto in particular, which is a city that's earned its reputation for not really valuing its history, where so much of our built heritage and archaeological heritage has been destroyed, and it can feel like a blank canvas so often. But by sort of engaging with it digitally, by digging up archival images and highlighting the fact that these are, even if a house has been destroyed, it's still a place. That corner still holds that history, that our street names still bear, colonial past in a lot of cases, and that by talking about those physical locations online, you can sort of highlight how important that physical built and archaeological heritage is, and sort of engage with people, teach them about it, so that when they're returning to those places or on their pandemic walks, they can be more aware of it than they might otherwise be.
I feel like this is a good moment to go to my third question, which isn't a smooth segue, but I think this is a good moment to kind of shift, because my last question is about imagining a new we. Do you think that this moment will allow us to imagine a new we? And the reason why I think this is kind of a good moment to like shift to that is because we's are imagined in a lot of different ways, but also into our proximity to spaces and places. So do you think that we will get a chance to kind of have greater circles of inclusion of who we understand to be part of a we, and that we can shift our notion of we and inclusion to be more inclusive?
Yeah, and it's a especially interesting question right now because I think the answers maybe shifted over the last few weeks. That it's not just about the pandemic now. This moment in history's more than just that, with the Black Lives Matter protests and the fact that everyone's having to confront sort of the past in ways they might not have had to before, and very specifically in terms of that we, and it becoming a more inclusive we. That, you know, when you talk about the history of Toronto in particular, in Canada in general, that process of that widening of we speaks so directly to the history of this place over the last few hundred years and through colonialism, and that, you know, this place and the city especially was built to be a very, very narrow we, that only British white Protestants were going to be part of that we, and that people have fought to expand that definition. And in Toronto, it's broader than it is in a lot of places and across Canada too. And this moment's made it clear that it's not nearly wide enough, and that we need to keep fighting to expand that definition. And that I think already it is broader than it was, you know, last week or 2 weeks ago, that people are having to confront that and having to redefine it. And even people who felt like their we was all encompassing are realizing they still have work to do. And that the way we tell our stories needs to keep evolving. That, you know, you don't get to a point where you're just like, oh yeah, now my stories that I'm telling are broad enough and inclusive enough. Yeah, no matter how far you've gone, you need to keep going and keep learning and keep listening and keep talking, and keep doing your best and ever evolving best. And that, yeah, there haven't been many moments in our lifetimes where that's been more obvious than it is right now. And that needs to keep changing, and that history is a way of highlighting that a lot of people, I think, like people who are not history people, old high school friends and other friends, have been talking about that. It's dawning on them now how important history is. And if we want to understand what's happening now, how things have ended up this way, and how we can change them, most importantly, then it's really important to be telling stories of how it all got to be this way, and those stories of the past. And that people are realizing things about Canada and Toronto that they haven't necessarily realized before. That this is a place, you know, that was built in part on slave labor. Hopefully, you know, giving opportunities to talk about that. Talk about how that definition of we has changed over time, so that people understand better how to keep changing it, and hopefully accelerate that change, and hopefully bring up, you know, our colonial past and genocide and nation-to-nation relationships and all those things that people might not have felt in their day-to-day lives was as viscerally important to them in their privileged space as it feels now. Now that we've got a moment where it's in the news all the time and filling Twitter feeds, and that people, you know, when they're not running around after their kids and trying to work and child rear all at the same time, you know, aren't just spending their time in bars or in theaters or wherever else they are. That this is a moment where, you know, more people maybe are having a chance to reflect on that and learn more about the place where they live and how it's come to be the way it is. And once you start seeing those repeating historical patterns, that this isn't, oh, just something that, you know, once Canada abolished slavery, everything was good. But you can see that these struggles have been going on and are continuing, that hopefully wakes people up to the reality of what it means to be Canadian in ways that aren't just, you know, patting yourself on the back for peacekeeping and multicultural policies, and realizing that it is a struggle that we all need to be a part of.
Well, and as I'm sure you know, Canada didn't abolish slavery, right? Like the British Empire abolished slavery, and Canada was just like part and parcel. Like we need to like be aware of like how our country was designed to be a country for white Protestants as a way to help rebuild a narrative that makes sense of the white supremacy and the racism built into so much of the politics and structures of the world that we live in, and that some people, people like myself and like you who identify as white, aren't as aware of as other people who are racialized, right?
Yeah, and it's a past, that just, especially in public discourse, and you know, with people who aren't paying that much attention to history, is just ridiculously whitewashed. That, you know, story of the Underground Railroad gets told. People mention on Simcoe Day in Toronto and parts of Ontario that he abolished slavery, which is not the story at all, because he filled his parliament with people who enslaved other people and who forced compromise and had it gradually phased out over time instead of abolished. And yeah, that it didn't get abolished till 40 years later when the British Empire abolished it. That, you know, Johnny MacDonald got reparations for his father-in-law's slavery being taken away from him and given, you know, freedom to people who had been enslaved, is not something that gets talked about. And a lot of the stories of how that continued. I'm working on a Twitter thread right now about how Toronto and other cities in Canada became hotbeds of support for the Confederacy during the American Civil War, which is 30 years after slavery was ended here. But there were still people who supported it, still people who fought for the South and who upheld the idea of slavery even decades after it ended here. And those people were, you know, leading figures in the city. Most Canadian newspapers were on the side of the South. There are still streets and schools named after them to this day, which is something I think most Canadians haven't realized, and is hopefully beginning to change a little bit. And certainly this is a moment where we can reach wider audiences with those stories, and hopefully help change people's perspectives of Canada. I think a lot of people think of it as a finished product, that, you know, we're more multicultural than other places, so great for us, and well done. And if anybody has any complaints about that, then they're just dredging up old stories that aren't relevant to today, and that is just viscerally and obviously untrue. And hopefully people are realizing that more through those stories of how it continued, and that, yeah, it was tweeted last week about the fact that Canada had slavery for like 29 years less than the United States did, which is not something most Canadians understand at all. And that's just one example among many of obviously our disturbing past that people who have been engaging with the material know, of course, and people in the wider world don't seem to understand nearly enough.
Well, and of course, I'll make sure that there's a link to your Twitter account below the video, and that perhaps that thread will have been published by the time this video goes up, and so people can read that. But that's so interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that thread myself. Thank you so much, Adam, for this really great talk. I just want to like pull together a couple things that you said, especially because this is kind of the end of this series for the summer, and I think these are kind of nice ideas to kind of pull together, to think about like teaching history after this moment as a historiography of the ways a struggle for we has become, like the ways that there has constantly been a struggle for we, I think can be a really interesting way to kind of explore a lot of these ideas, because a lot of educators don't know these histories, and what I've always said is like, that's okay, just be like, let's learn it together, right? And so thinking of your classroom or your other like history spaces as learning with your students, the historiography, like how stories get constructed and therefore what gets left out, thinking about how we gets imagined through various discourses, I think is really powerful. So thank you so much for bringing all of that to this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, they're fascinating, interesting stories, and that has been a central thread in the history of Toronto and Canada. Something I've been learning a lot about with the Toronto Book of Love, stories I didn't necessarily know about. The first bill ever introduced in Upper Canadian history was to expand the definition of marriage, because it was such a narrow Protestant institution in the beginning. You can follow that thread for 200 years of people fighting for the right to love and marry who they wanted. And that those are ongoing processes in so many different parts of our lives and everyone's lives.
And remind us when the Book of Love will be out.
It'll be out in January, pandemic allowing, just in time for Valentine's Day next year.
And of course, the Book of the Dead is already out, and then people can get that.
Yep, it's at all the bookstores and the online shops too.
All right, well, thank you so much, Adam. This was really great, and well, I'll make sure to connect with all your projects for everyone that is interested, and hopefully we stay connected.
Great, thanks so much for having me.
All right, see you later.